The problem, though, Jim, and it's much broader than perhaps this discussion, but I find that all manner of government departments hide behind privacy legislation when it's convenient for them.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Leo Knight, former RCMP and Vancouver police officer, security consultant, newspaper columnist for 24 Hours Vancouver. Today, though, I don't know if it's law enforcement or just a social issue, but the way that people are handing out tranquilizers and other drugs to people who seem to have even just minor depression, specifically the prescription drugs that are in the SSRI class, that's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And Leo, we've both noticed, it seems, when we have mass shootings, machete attacks, knifings in schools, on the street, that somehow these drugs might be involved. We suspect they might be involved, but do we have any solid information that SSRIs are connected to mass, what I call antisocial violent acts?
Yeah. SSRIs is a category, but basically it falls into the much broader, or under the umbrella category of psychotropic meds. And I did some research a couple of years back where I started looking at all the mass shootings that were occurring in the United States. And in 100% of the cases, the shooters were on some variation of a psychotropic med.
And yet, do we hear that in the news reports or the reports from the courthouse about it?
Again, unless it's someone like me who will write about it, no, you won't. It's one of those conversations that most mainstream media types don't want to get into. Either they don't understand it, they think it's too complicated a story to tell, or for whatever reason, it's not fair to bash the mentally ill. There's 1,000 different reasons, but they just won't go down that path.
Now, the drugs we're talking about go under the commercial names such as, and this is just a short list, Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Luvox, Franklin, Cymbalta, Celexa, Welcatrin, and Lexapro. And of course, there's many more. Many more. But one thing that they might have in common as well is that the mainstream media does depend a lot on all those ads you see for these drugs. So if you are questioning whether these drugs work or whether they might be harmful, you might also be biting the hand that feeds you.
Well, I suppose to a point. Serious journalists would always say that it doesn't matter who advertises in their pages, that doesn't push them off the story. Is that, an across-the-board thing? No, I wouldn't say it is, but certainly, reputable outlets should not let advertising dollars affect what they report on.
But I've heard from newspaper reporters that they're not allowed to run stories about odometers being rolled back because one of their major sources of revenue is car ads from car dealers. Now, isn't that, kind of the same thing?
Well, I suppose it is, but having said that, a reputable car dealer doesn't roll back odometers, and, the guys who do probably don't advertise in newspapers. So I don't know. I'd be skeptical about that statement.
Or how about in Florida, where somebody did a story about Dow and Monsanto putting dangerous chemicals on fruit, and the television station was told, if you run the story, we pull our ads worth $6 million a year from your television station. And that one was documented.
Yeah. That sort of thing, while I know it does happen, I don't know that it's widespread. Certainly there's enough shadows over the chemical industry the drug producing industry, relative to, paying money to doctors to promote their drug versus another. And there's certainly stuff about them lobbying government to halt production of or licensing of generic drugs. And there's all kinds of shady stuff that does go on.
But back to the issue then of the psychotropic drugs, how extensively are they used, do you think?
I think they're overused. In my day, if you were not paying attention in school, the teacher would hit your desk with a ruler, or perhaps you might get a cuff behind the ear. Nowadays, it's called ADHD, and they prescribe drugs for it. And so oftentimes these kids who are just kids, normal kids, they get this diagnosis hung around their head, and they're prescribed drugs, and they could be on these drugs for the rest of their lives. And in some cases, as I say, these drugs cause incredibly violent behavior.
Do we know why these drugs might do that, or have you heard anything about it?
No, I really don't know why. I just know from my own research that it seems to be a common denominator in these cases.
And I know, having covered some of these cases that might be related to that, the courts seal the medical records, saying they have a right to privacy. But if you're, for example, a shooter who has been killed by the police or has taken their own lives, they don't release those records either. I thought you couldn't slander a dead person.
Yeah, you can't. You can't libel a dead person, for sure. The problem, though, Jim, and it's much broader than perhaps this discussion, but I find that all manner of government departments hide behind privacy legislation when it's convenient for them. And I think it's really overused and over-abused, especially by various levels of government and government agencies.
And I also hear if some controversial issue has been is on its way to the courts, they always say, I can't comment because it's in the courts, but you can comment as long as it's not a prejudicial comment about a suspect or a case. But if you have an opinion or think you're informed in some way, there's no law that stops you from saying anything about it unless a judge has put a publication ban on it. That's correct.
The Privacy Act and there's different federal and provincial privacy statutes across Canada, and there's also equally every province has some sort of Freedom of Information Act, as does the Fed. So there's multiple pieces of legislation depending on where you're trying to get the information from, and typically they will hide behind that as an excuse not to be open with the public.
And of course, if you're an investigative reporter, as soon as someone starts using an excuse for not releasing information, nothing makes you work harder to find out what the hell's behind it.
Well, yeah, I wish more journalists would work harder, though, but it seems to me that too many reporters nowadays are just scribes for press releases.
Yes, and I've seen movie reviews based on the trailer. I said, well, that's like doing a restaurant review based on the ad that you saw on TV.
Yeah, or a book review based on the back cover.
Yes, and what was the old saying? Never judge a book by its cover?
Exactly.
I've seen so many movies where the trailer does look delightful and you've never been more disappointed in your life when you go. Is there any way for people to find a way around these artificial roadblocks, to find out how often are these drugs involved in violent incidents, and is there a better way to treat people than shoot them if they are acting out of their heads and not obeying police orders?
Well, there's better ways, if you will, other ways, non-lethal ways, but even in Vancouver, in the most recent officer-involved shooting we saw just the other day, they tried non-lethal weapons. In that case, they used a beanbag gun. That didn't work until finally they had to use lethal force. It's unfortunate, it's tragic, it's 1,000 different adjectives, but it happens, and it happens all too frequently.
Well, Leo, you're a man who was trained how to use firearms. I hope you didn't have to use one, but is there a better way? People always ask me, couldn't they have just shot him in the foot, and then that way he would have fallen down and he would have been safe to approach?
Well, I just point you at the story that's in the news right now from Ferguson, Missouri. He fired a total of 12 shots and hit him 6 times. And he was shooting at center of mass, which is a big target, especially in this case.
Right. The officer may be falling or has been injured himself, not going to be that accurate of a shooter.
Well, it's partly that. It's partly adrenaline. It's there's all kinds of side factors to what happens. The school of thought that police are trained by is that you shoot at the center of mass, in other words, the largest piece of the target, until the threat is eliminated. And then you can't deviate by that by trying to, wing him on the arm, or couldn't you shoot him in the foot, or whatever. It's just not the way reality. These things typically escalate from 0 to 60 in a heartbeat.
And handguns aren't really all that accurate, are they? When you're moving and the other person's moving.
They're a close combat weapon. and the more distance, the less accurate.
We'll have more with Leo Knight right after this.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
In Goddard we trust.
Welcome back. We're speaking to Leo Knight, security consultant and author of the blog PrimetimeCrime.com. Are officers scared to use their tasers now because we've had fatalities connected to the use of tasers and a lot of restrictions put on their use?
Well, I mean, the police have totally re-engineered their training for the use of tasers in the wake of the Zakansky case, and fair enough. But, I question the hand wringers, Jim, that everybody was screaming about taser use after that incident. And then if you take away a taser, then they go from an asked baton, which they can't use hardly at all anyway, because somebody with an iPhone will scream police brutality because they're using a baton on somebody. And the only other option they've got is lethal force in terms of their sidearm. You can't have it all ways. The police need weapons in order to do their job because of what they're faced with on a day-to-day basis.
And I've seen cases, too, where officers have been chastised by their superiors for not shooting someone because they tried to use every other method possible to subdue what was a person out of their head.
Well, in every case, there's a post-mortem done. And now I'm not talking about on shooting somebody who was shot. I'm talking about a critical incident debrief where the circumstances of the event are reviewed around a table with a number of different people, those who were there, some higher level people, and some use of force experts, where they dissect the incident and try and learn something from it. And certainly there are times when an officer could be criticized for perhaps having hesitated too long.
But of course,
possibly risking somebody's life by doing that.
And I was going to say, too, every incident is different, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's some common denominators for sure, but yeah, every incident is different. And it really comes down to, at the end of the day, what the officer's perception of the danger he faces. I mean, I've heard in the wake of the Vancouver shooting last week, saying, well, it was just a 2x4. Well, just a 2x4. I've been hit in the face with a 2x4 and I wasn't expecting it, and it blew my face apart, shattered my nose, and knocked me clean cold. Could have killed me. So, just a 2x4 is not a good way of looking at it.
Well, take a look at your martial arts weapons. Those were all designed from farming implements because the ancient Chinese were banned from carrying weapons.
Yeah.
So anything, if in the hands of the wrong person, could become a weapon, I guess.
Well, yeah. Even a stapler in the hands of Robert Zakansky. You ever been hit in the face with a metal stapler?
No, I don't hope to be either.
No. Exactly.
But I have played hockey, and I can tell you a hockey stick sure hurts.
Exactly. But, again, that's it's what's in the person's hands. Could it be construed as a weapon? Could it do damage, possibly even lethal damage if you get hit with it? We saw another shooting a few years back where a guy had a chain with a great big a padlock, big metal padlock on the end of it, and the chain was about, I think, 8 feet long. Well, you will get hit with that as he's swinging it. It'll do a lot of damage.
And in that incident, an officer did suffer broken bones.
Yes, that officer had a fractured skull.
Yeah, which, again, a life-threatening injury.
Could be.
Are you in favor of officers having to wear video cameras all the time?
I never would have said in past that I would have been. I shudder to think, sort of in hindsight, at some of the arrests I've been involved with, if they'd been subject to complete scrutiny by body cam. Having said that, I'm changing my way of thinking of late because of the citizen journalists. Even watching the riot coverage last night and the night before in Ferguson, every time the police got involved, there was a scene in New York City. I thought, as I was watching it, they arrested somebody in Manhattan, and about 30 people around the officers that were making the arrest all had iPhones up in the air, or smartphones, all taking video of it. The officers' actions are being scrutinized by these citizen journalists, and typically you get a short piece of video that doesn't have the full context of what happened. you get a perception of one angle of in this period of time sort of context. And I think body cams on police would provide the complete incident context and make for a lot better analysis of what happened and allow the police actually to defend themselves for the actions they've taken.
Well, I interviewed the gentleman who invented the cop cam, the camera in police cars, which nowadays, by the way, is 360 degrees. They capture everything around the car and all the sound. There's a microphone in the car and a microphone on the officer. He said 98% of the time when there's a complaint against one of those officers with a cop cam, that complaint results in the officer being exonerated. In that he acted exactly the right way. 1% of the time it's a wash, and 1% of the time the officer was at fault.
Yeah, I believe that. And certainly cases that I've been involved in where you hear the complaint and you're thinking as you're taking the complaint or interviewing the individual, you think, my God, that sounds horrible. And then you do your investigation, you come up with video that shows the person was, at best misconstruing the facts and at worst lying outright.
And of course, the old, their word against this other person's word, you would hope the word of a sworn police officer would be accurate. But sometimes what they see and hear and experience is totally different than somebody else. All you have to do is ask somebody who went on holiday with you 5 years ago what they remember and what you remember. Two different trips. Yeah,
it's perception, it's context, it's all of those things. So, again, as I said, I didn't, initially I would have said no. But now I've come around and I'm thinking if I were a police officer today, I'd want one.
Plus, I know there's privacy concerns, and somebody asked me, how would you like to have everything you do at work recorded? Well, all of the studios are covered by security cameras, and everything I say does go on, work-related goes on the air. So I don't know how more public you could be. Airline pilots are 100% scrutinized by video now and voice recordings and how their
Even bus drivers are.
Bus drivers. So if you're in public doing a public job, you're already under surveillance. And a friend of mine who does advice for governments asking about how they should be perceived in the media, he said if you proceed like you're in front of a camera all the time, you know something? You probably don't have much to worry about.
Yep, this is probably very true. And also we have to adjust our way of thinking to 2014 technology. I mean, this is, there's technology is improving in leaps and bounds, and we have to adjust our thinking to correspond to the capabilities of that technology.
Yeah, that goes back, I think, to just treat people the way you like to be treated and be polite. And, it's funny how many bad situations can turn out okay.
Yeah, exactly. Things you learned in kindergarten, right?
Yeah, that book was right.
Yeah.
Leo, anything else you'd like to say about these drugs that we started off talking about and it turned into other issues, but I think they're all related in how do you deal with potential violent incidents and how to keep things under control?
The only other thing I might add is clearly the issue of mental health is being more and more talked about as there are more and more of these incidents that seem to be occurring on a regular basis. The fact that psychotropic meds seem to be a common denominator in these cases, I think needs to be really added to the equation. And the medical industry, the physicians who treat mental health really need to understand, let's call it the ramifications or the longer term effects of these types of drugs, especially if they're being prescribed at a young age.
And of so many of these drugs, too, they remind us, have only been approved for use in adults, yet teenagers are getting them.
No, younger than that even, Jim.
Wow. Whatever happened to the old, geez, you have so much energy to burn? For me, it was go out and work with your dad on the farm.
Yeah, or go out and play, or,
yeah,
whatever. It's, I never had a problem as a kid, with my mother taking me to a doctor saying, what's wrong with him? He's got so much energy or he doesn't pay attention or whatever. As I said, if I wasn't paying attention to my mother, she got my attention pretty darn quick and held it.
Yeah, I had hockey, baseball, football, soccer, and farm work.
Exactly. Exactly. I think, one of the good things about our world today is technology. And in a lot of ways, one of the bad things in our world today is technology. I think in the video game age, I think has done a lot to perhaps inhibit the appropriate maturation of kids.
And something too, I should want to remind Canadian viewer or listeners is that Canada's murder rate is at its lowest rate it's been since 1966. Yet we have about 15 million more people than we had back then. So something must be working.
Some things are working for sure, and the gang culture seems to be diminishing in most of our cities. It hasn't been eradicated, but it seems to be diminishing. A lot more people are realizing that gang life is not what it's cracked up to be, and that certainly helps. The other converse of that, of course, is the drug use is still increasing, and that causes other problems. We see deaths from ecstasy. We see the use of methamphetamine rising. We see home-based labs with technology that are able to produce this stuff. Those are frightening things too.
And of course, that doesn't show up in your homicide stats, does it?
Not at all.
Leo, thanks a lot for chatting with us.
Anytime, Jim.
Folks, don't forget to check out Leo Knight's website, primetimecrime.com. He's also on Twitter at primetimecrime. Leo, thanks again.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to The Goddard Report on TalkDigitalNetwork.com. You can find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. We have a YouTube channel, Talk Digital Network. Comments or questions about the show can be sent to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on The Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.